The low thrum of the generator was a familiar lullaby in the mobile forensic unit at remote crime scene, a constant companion to the hum of the microscope and the rhythmic tick of the air purifier. Outside, the early autumn chill clung to the pine needles, but inside the air was warm, smelling faintly of antiseptic and the metallic tang of something deeper, something I hadn't quite identified yet. I leaned over the oculars, my breath fogging the cool glass for a moment before I adjusted my mask. My eyes, accustomed to hours of intense scrutiny, scanned the slide beneath the lens, another dead end. The sample was a swab from the victim's pristine kitchen counter. Under 400x magnification, it was just nothing. A few dust motes, some inert fibers, probably from the cleaning cloth the police analyst had used to collect the sample. Not a single epidermal cell. No latent print residue, no trace of a struggle, nothing that screamed crime. It was almost insulting in its emptiness. I straightened, rubbing the bridge of my nose. My fingers, usually steady, felt a faint tremor. This wasn't just a lack of evidence. It was an active, aggressive absence. Someone had gone to extraordinary lengths. Anything, Cole. The voice belonged to the detective, a solid, unyielding presence who now filled the doorway of my lab space within the unit. He was a man who preferred tangible evidence, the kind that could be bagged, tagged, and presented without a doctoral dissertation. His gaze, usually sharp, held a weariness that spoke volumes about the pressure he was under. I turned from the microscope, gesturing vaguely at the sterile workstation. Only the profound emptiness of the universe, detective, and a profound lack of anything useful from the scene. He grunted, stepping inside. The unit's cramped quarters suddenly felt smaller. The commissioner is breathing down my neck. You know who the victim was. A prominent politician's aide. I confirmed, the name unspoken but understood, which only makes this more perplexing. People don't usually go to this much trouble for a run-of-the-mill robbery gone wrong. Exactly. This isn't a run-of-the-mill anything. The apartment was spotless. Not a single forced entry. No signs of struggle on the body that we could discern at a glance. The medical examiner's preliminary report confirms a single, precise puncture wound, almost surgical, and nothing else. He sighed, running a hand over his close-cropped hair. No prints, no fibers, no hair. It's like the killer wore a hazmat suit and then bleached the entire place. I nodded, the frustration a familiar knot in my stomach. This was precisely the kind of case that both maddened and invigorated me. Where others saw nothing, I saw a challenge, a whisper in the silence. My mind didn't just look for what was there, it obsessed over what wasn't. The missing pieces often told a more compelling story than the obvious ones. It was a skill honed over years, a gift and a curse, allowing me to perceive the microscopic universe that existed just beyond the threshold of normal vision. Bleaching would leave a chemical residue, I mused, more to myself than to him. And even a hazmat suit sheds particles. Everything leaves a trace, detective, everything. He looked at me, a flicker of something that might have been hope in his eyes, quickly replaced by his usual skepticism. You always say that, but we've got nothing. The CSU team spent 12 hours in that apartment, Cole. 12 hours. They came back with empty evidence bags and a headache. Then they weren't looking hard enough, I said, my voice quiet but firm. I knew it sounded arrogant, but I meant it as a statement of fact. My methods weren't about speed. They were about depth, about peeling back layers that most people didn't even know existed. Or they were looking for the wrong things. A killer this meticulous doesn't just get lucky. They plan. And planning, by its very nature, creates its own kind of footprint, however faint. I turned back to my workstation, picking up a different slide. This one held a scraping from a barely perceptible seam in the victim's kitchen floor tiles, a place where dirt and debris usually congregated, a tiny canyon where evidence often hid. I meticulously positioned it under the lens, adjusting the focus wheel with a practiced touch. The fluorescent lights hummed above, reflecting in the pristine surface of the equipment. The detective didn't leave. I could feel his presence, a tangible weight of expectation. The pressure was immense, a silent demand to conjure answers from thin air. But I thrived in that pressure. It sharpened my focus, pushing me to see beyond the obvious. I began my scan, moving the slide fraction by fraction across the field of view. The initial passes revealed the usual microscopic landscape: mineral dust, lint, a few stray hairs, likely from the victim herself. Nothing unusual, nothing that screamed killer. My jaw tightened. Had I finally met my match? Was this the one time the invisible adversary had truly managed to erase every single trace? Then in the far corner of the field, just as I was about to move to the next section, I saw it. A speck. Smaller than a grain of salt, almost invisible to the naked eye. It wasn't organic, not a fiber, not a cell. It had a peculiar metallic sheen, catching the light in a way that felt unnatural. It was embedded, almost fused into the linoleum, as if it had been pressed there with significant force. The edges were sharp, almost crystalline, and its color was a dull, dark gray, almost black, unlike anything I'd ever seen in a domestic setting. It was so minute, so utterly insignificant that anyone else would have dismissed it as a fleck of paint or a speck of dirt. But my gut tightened. This wasn't dirt. This was something else entirely. My fingers paused on the microscope's stage control. My breath hitched. This was a deliberate anomaly in a field of nothingness, a single, defiant whisper in the profound silence. The detective shifted his weight behind me. Anything yet coal or just more dust? I didn't answer immediately. My gaze was locked on the tiny speck. It was a pinprick of rebellion against the meticulously crafted emptiness. A single, almost invisible thread. This was the first true mark left by an adversary who believed they had left none. Unravel. The cool night air, sharp with the scent of damp earth and distant pine, was a welcome sting against my face as I stepped out of the silent house. The yellow tape flapped a lazy rhythm in the breeze, a stark contrast to the rigid stillness inside. I clutched the small, sealed evidence bag containing that defiant thread. It felt like a secret whispered directly into my palm. Anything Cole. The detective, a burly figure whose impatience was always barely contained, stood by the rear door of the mobile forensic unit at remote crime scene, his breath plumed in the cold. I met his gaze, my own thoughts still miles away, replaying the sterile perfection of the living room. More than nothing, I replied, a cryptic answer that I knew would only fuel his frustration. Let's get this unit humming. I want every surface of that house swabbed, vacuumed, and lifted. And I mean every surface. Don't look for what's there, look for what isn't. He grunted, a sound of resigned acceptance, and gestured to a colleague who was already unlocking the unit. The interior of the mobile forensic unit at remote crime scene was a compact world of stainless steel and blinking lights, a self-contained laboratory on wheels. I moved to my station, a pristine workbench equipped with a powerful stereo microscope. The mobile forensic unit at remote crime scene was a familiar sanctuary, a place where the chaos of the world outside was distilled into solvable puzzles. My hands, steady and practiced, retrieved a pair of fine-tipped forceps. With painstaking care, I opened the evidence bag and transferred the single-minute thread onto a clean glass slide. Cole, the preliminary reports are still showing 0 prints. 0 foreign fibers, no blood spatter, no DNA beyond the victims. A junior pathologist, a bright but conventional mind, spoke from the adjacent workstation, his voice tinged with a familiar bewilderment. It's like a ghost did it. Ghosts leave traces, I murmured, my eye already pressed to the eyepiece of the microscope. The world beyond the lens sharpened, the tiny thread transforming into a miniature cable, a complex weave of individual filaments. It wasn't cotton, not wool. It had a synthetic sheen, a uniform texture that spoke of industrial precision. I adjusted the focus, bringing a minute anomaly into stark relief. It was a slight discoloration, almost imperceptible to the naked eye, a faint reddish-brown speck adhering to one of the synthetic strands. Not blood, I instinctively knew. The color was too dull, too earthy. This is not a ghost, I said, my voice low. This is a professional. It tells us they went to extraordinary lengths. and extraordinary lengths usually leave behind extraordinary mistakes. I looked up, meeting the junior pathologist's gaze. "I want you to take the dust samples from the baseboards, not the obvious ones, the ones tucked into the tightest corners, behind the radiator under the lip of the windowsill. I want to know what they missed. And I want every square inch of the victim's clothing, even the unseen seams, examined for any trace of an abrasive, anything that might have been used to clean." He nodded, a flicker of understanding replacing the initial confusion in his eyes. He was starting to grasp my philosophy. The cleaner the slate, the louder the scream of what was erased. Back under the microscope, I zoomed in on the reddish-brown speck. It was crystalline with an irregular, almost jagged edge. I switched to a higher magnification, the individual facets of the crystal becoming visible. It wasn't organic, it looked mineral, like a fragment of rock, perhaps, but what kind? And how did it get onto a synthetic thread in a meticulously cleaned house? My mind raced, connecting the dots of the impossible. A thread that shouldn't be there, carrying a speck that defied the narrative of sterile perfection. This wasn't a random fiber from a passing jacket. This thread was specific. The speck was specific. I carefully used a microneedle to scrape the tiny crystal from the thread, transferring it to another slide. The cleaning agent they used, I thought aloud. It was thorough, but not perfect. I considered the possibility that the cleaning itself had left something behind or agitated something previously hidden. What if the speck wasn't an oversight? What if it was part of the cleaning process? I grabbed a small, specialized kit, a collection of reagents and testing strips I'd customized over the years. A single drop of a mild acidic solution onto the crystal. Under the microscope, I watched, holding my breath. A faint effervescence, a chemical reaction. My eyes widened. Calcite, limestone, a common mineral, yes, but its presence here on this specific synthetic thread in a house scrubbed clean suddenly clicked into place. Calcite is often found in abrasive cleaning powders in certain types of scouring agents, but this wasn't just a trace. This was a fragment. This wasn't just a random particle. This was the ghost of a vigorous scrub, a desperate attempt to eradicate every trace. This was not a general-purpose cleaning product. The fragment size, its specific crystalline structure, suggested a particular type of industrial abrasive designed for heavy-duty work. The adversary wasn't just meticulous, they were resourceful, and they had left their calling card disguised as absence. I leaned back from the microscope, the hum of the unit suddenly louder, more insistent. The thread, the speck of calcite, they weren't just clues. They were an invitation. The reddish-brown speck shimmered under the focused beam of the microscope, its crystalline structure catching the light in a way that was both beautiful and profoundly unsettling. I adjusted the magnification, bringing the edges into sharper relief, my breath held tight in my chest. It wasn't just a random fleck of dirt or dried blood. It had a distinct geometry, almost too perfect for something so small. Irregular, almost. Faceted. I murmured, mostly to myself, my voice a low rumble in the quiet hum of the mobile forensic unit at remote crime scene. The air inside the unit was thick with the faint, sterile tang of disinfectants and the metallic scent of various instruments, a stark contrast to the damp, earthy smell that still clung to my clothes from the crime scene outside. The detective, who had been leaning over my shoulder, straightened up, giving me some space. He hadn't said much since my lecture on absence, but his presence was a constant, solid weight. I nudged the controls, rotating the slide a fraction of a millimeter. The speck turned, revealing new facets, each one catching the light with a subtle, deep crimson glow. It was a mineral, not quartz, not feldspar. This was something rarer, something with a specific geological signature. I ran through the mental database I'd built over decades, cross-referencing crystal habits, refractive indices, color saturation. Then it hit me. A jolt, like static electricity snapping against my skin. The specific hue, the way it fractured, the faint striations it matched a particular inclusion I'd only seen a few times in specialized samples. A micro-fragment of a very specific type of iron oxide mineral, almost ruby-like in its intensity. It was distinctive, often found embedded in a unique kind of metamorphic rock, typically associated with ancient volcanic formations. My fingers trembled slightly as I pulled back from the eyepiece. This wasn't something I'd pick up walking down a city street or even in most suburban parks. This was a geological signature, a specific fingerprint of the Earth itself, pointing to a very particular, isolated environment. "It's an inclusion," I finally said, my voice barely above a whisper, the words feeling heavy on my tongue. "A type of hematite, but with a unique crystalline structure. It's not common. In fact, it's characteristic of a rare geological formation." The detective grunted, a non-committal sound. "Meaning what, Cole? Our victim was hiking in the Himalayas before they ended up in their living room." I ignored the sarcasm. It was a defense mechanism, I knew. He wanted answers, neatly packaged. I was giving him fragments of a puzzle he didn't yet understand. "Meaning this specific type of hematite is primarily found in a cluster of old, unexcavated quarries and a small, protected nature preserve about 100 miles north of here. The terrain is rugged, mostly untouched." My mind raced, connecting the dots. The victim was found in a meticulously cleaned house. No forced entry, no obvious struggle. The cleaning had been professional, thorough. Yet this speck, microscopic and tenacious, had clung to something, perhaps a shoe, a garment, a hair, before being transferred to the victim's body. It was an anomaly, a rogue pixel in an otherwise perfect blank canvas. "A nature preserve?" the detective asked, his tone now laced with genuine surprise. "Our victim, they were a librarian, quiet life. No record of outdoor activities, not even a gym membership." He paused, his brow furrowing. "And a quarry? What would they be doing in an old quarry?" That was the question, wasn't it? The piece of evidence was insignificant in size, yet it was screaming its location, challenging every assumption we'd made about the victim's routine, their life, and ultimately, their last moments. The meticulous cleaning implied a killer who knew what they were doing, someone who sought to erase every trace. But even the most diligent cleaner couldn't account for every microscopic particle that hitchhiked on clothing or skin. "It complicates things," I admitted, leaning back in my chair, running a hand over my close-cropped hair. "It doesn't tell us why they were there or who they were with, but it tells us where they might have been very recently before the murder, or perhaps where someone else was." The tension in the mobile unit thickened, a palpable weight. This wasn't just a random clue, it was a crack in the carefully constructed facade of the crime. This speck, no larger than a grain of sand, suggested a hidden life, a secret rendezvous, a connection to someone who frequented these remote, geologically unique locations. "So, we're looking for a librarian who secretly scaled rock faces, a killer who moonlights as a geologist," the detective muttered. There was a new glint in his eye, a spark of renewed purpose. He was starting to see the thread, however fine. I just stared at the magnified image on the screen, the reddish speck glowing like a tiny, malevolent eye. This wasn't just a breakthrough, it was a door opening into a darker, more complex narrative. The quiet librarian, the pristine crime scene, and now, a remote, rugged landscape. The invisible adversary had made a mistake, a microscopic one, but a mistake nonetheless, and I intended to follow it wherever it led. The hunt had truly begun. The air in the mobile forensic unit at remote crime scene hung thick with the scent of sterile wipes and my own simmering frustration. My eyes, weary from hours squinting through the oculars, were still fixed on the magnified image of that tiny speck. It wasn't just a random particle, I felt it in my gut. This speck, no larger than a grain of sand, was a crack, a whisper of truth in a meticulously silenced room. I adjusted the focus knob, bringing the microscopic fibers into sharper relief. The speck was a composite, I realized, not a single material. There was a fleck of dried mud, unremarkable in a remote, outdoor setting, but intertwined with it was something else, something synthetic. Under the powerful microscope, the individual strands shimmered, a peculiar blend of deep indigo and an almost iridescent silver. I zoomed in further, pushing the limits of the optical magnification. The weave was tight, almost braided, unlike any common textile I'd encountered recently in my work. My breath hitched. This wasn't just any synthetic fiber. This was a specific blend, a unique construction. I knew it. The recognition slammed into me with the force of a physical blow, cold and sharp. My hands, usually steady, trembled slightly as I reached for the digital camera attached to the microscope, snapping a series of high-resolution images. The indigo and silver, the tight, braided weave. It was a material I hadn't seen in years, not since. Not since the old fishing nets my grandfather used to mend. Not the industrial kind, but the specialized, handmade ones, crafted for a specific deep-sea purpose. The kind he taught me to tie knots with, sitting on the rickety dock, the salt spray cooling my face, his calloused fingers guiding mine. A jolt of memory, unwanted and painful, shot through me. The last time I'd seen that material was in the small, weathered tackle box he'd left behind, tucked away in the attic after he was gone. This couldn't be a coincidence. The chances of finding such a specific, almost artisanal fiber blend at a seemingly random crime scene, so far from any coast, were astronomically low. But the image under the lens stubbornly refused to transform into anything less significant. There was someone playing a sick game. There was this adversary, this ghost, deliberately leaving breadcrumbs that only I would recognize. The thought sent a shiver down my spine, prickling the hairs on my arms. The case was no longer just a puzzle. It felt like a personal challenge, a gauntlet thrown directly at my feet. The meticulous cleaning, the lack of conventional evidence, it all pointed to someone who knew how I worked, someone who understood the microscopic world I inhabited. And now this deliberate, cruel reminder of a past I tried so hard to compartmentalize. I leaned back from the microscope, rubbing my temples, the fluorescent lights of the unit buzzing overhead. My gaze swept across my workstation, a familiar landscape of tools, slides, and sterile containers. Nothing seemed out of place. The mobile unit was secure, locked down, the detective and his team keeping a perimeter outside. No one should have been able to get in. But then my eyes landed on the edge of my dissection tray, nestled amongst the freshly sterilized scalpels and forceps. A small object, barely noticeable at first glance, lay there. Not the indigo and silver fiber, but something simpler, almost mundane. Yet the knot itself. It was a fisherman's bend, a specific complex knot my grandfather had always said was the strongest, the most reliable. The kind I'd used to secure a line to a hook or two lines together, ensuring they wouldn't slip. My breath caught in my throat. I hadn't tied that knot. I hadn't even touched that thread. It was placed there deliberately, silently. This wasn't just a clue. It was a message. A very precise, very personal message. Someone had been in here. Someone knew what I was looking for. Someone knew about my grandfather, that they were closer than I could possibly imagine. The remote crime scene suddenly felt like the most exposed place on Earth. The mystery had deepened, yes, but it had also twisted into something far more sinister, far more personal. This wasn't just about finding a killer anymore. It was about surviving a hunter. It wasn't just a random particle. I felt it in my gut, a prickle of intuition that had saved my skin more times than I cared to count. Under the harsh LED light, the speck shimmered with an almost unnatural luminescence. I adjusted the focus, bringing the intricate details into sharper relief. It wasn't organic dust, nor a common textile fiber. It was a synthetic fiber, no thicker than a spider silk, but its crystalline structure was unlike anything I'd logged in my extensive database. Each microscopic facet caught the light, refracting it into a faint, almost iridescent glow. And then nestled within its interwoven strands, I saw it, a single, perfectly preserved pollen grain. My breath hitched. This wasn't just any pollen. The morphology, the distinct ridges and pores, I knew it. It was from a Phalaenopsis bellina, an incredibly rare orchid species, highly prized by collectors, known for its intense fragrance and specific habitat requirements. It wasn't native to this region, not by a long shot. Its presence here, trapped within a synthetic fiber of unknown origin, screamed deliberate placement or an incredibly specific chain of events. I pulled back from the microscope, rubbing my temples. The silence in the unit pressed in, broken only by the hum of the ventilation system. This wasn't just a meticulously cleaned scene, it was a carefully curated one. The adversary hadn't just removed evidence, they'd left behind a breadcrumb, a signature. And it was a signature of immense confidence, almost contempt. They knew I'd find it. They wanted me to find it. A cold shiver traced its way down my spine. The meticulousness, the almost surgical precision in the scene's preparation, the absence of conventional traces. And now this microscopic anomaly, it was all too familiar. The ghost case, they'd called it. The same unnerving perfection, the same feeling of chasing smoke. I leaned forward again, my mind racing. The fiber, the orchid pollen. The combination was too specific to be random. This wasn't a careless mistake. This was a message. The synthetic fiber, with its unique properties, suggested a cutting-edge material, perhaps used in specialized industries or high-end bespoke garments, a world where money talked and secrets were currency. And the Phalaenopsis bellina, its rarity and value pointed to a specific type of individual, a collector, someone with resources, perhaps even a specific network. A sudden, jarring thought clicked into place. What if the fiber wasn't from the perpetrator, but from the victim, or a previous victim? What if this adversary wasn't just killing, but eliminating those who possessed something valuable, something that could expose them? The orchid pollen, then, could be a trace from a clandestine meeting, a gift, or even a trophy. My eyes narrowed. Blackmail, revenge. These weren't random acts of violence. This was targeted, precise, and deeply personal. The adversary wasn't just invisible, they were intelligent, knowledgeable about both their targets and forensic science itself. They were playing a game, and I had just found their opening move. I felt a surge of adrenaline cutting through the fatigue. This wasn't just a case anymore, it was a confrontation. They were challenging me, pushing me to see the pattern, to recognize their handiwork. Cole. The voice of the detective, muffled by the unit's insulated walls, startled me. He stood framed in the doorway, a mug of lukewarm coffee in his hand, his expression a mix of exhaustion and weary expectation. Anything. I looked up, my gaze still distant, focused on the swirling implications of the microscopic world I'd just uncovered. More than anything, I finally managed. My voice a low rumble. We're not looking for a killer who cleans up. We're looking for a ghost who leaves calling cards. And I think I've just found one. I tapped the microscope stage, my finger hovering over the infinitesimal speck, my mind already sifting through the archives of the ghost case, desperately searching for a similar, overlooked trace. And found one. The detective, who had been leaning against the workbench, slowly straightened. His expression, usually a mask of weary patience, now held a flicker of something sharper, more focused. A calling card. What are you talking about, Cole? We found nothing but an impossibly clean crime scene. I peeled my eye away from the microscope, the swirling implications of the microscopic world still vivid behind my eyelids. I gestured for him to take my place. See for yourself. Top left quadrant of the slide near the barely visible scratch. I've highlighted it with the micro laser. He hesitated for a moment, then leaned in, adjusting the eyepiece. His breath hitched slightly. Is that a crystal? Not a crystal in the geological sense. I explained, my voice low, the analytical part of my brain already constructing a narrative. It's a synthetic particulate, complex molecular structure, highly refractive, almost iridescent under polarized light. Not something you'd find in dust or soil or even most industrial byproducts. It's too uniform, too designed. I tapped the side of the microscope in the mobile forensic unit at remote crime scene. And I found 3 identical particulates, each no larger than a grain of pollen, embedded in the victim's clothing fibers, specifically around the cuffs and collar. Places a killer might brush against, or where minute transfer could occur during a struggle, even a brief one. The detective pulled back, his brow furrowed. So, someone deliberately left behind a custom-made glitter. Not glitter, I corrected. Glitter is crude, this is precision. It's like a signature left by someone who knows we're looking, someone who wants us to know they were there, but only if we know how to look. It's a taunt, a challenge. I felt a cold knot tighten in my stomach. This wasn't just a meticulous killer, this was a performer, and I was now part of the audience. Before we could delve deeper, the door to the unit creaked open, admitting a gust of cool, damp air and a new face. A colleague, a senior pathologist from Central Command, stepped inside. He was a man known for his rigid adherence to protocol and a barely concealed disdain for anything he considered speculative. He carried himself with an air of official gravitas, his gaze sweeping over me with an almost accusatory intensity. "Pathologist Cole," he began, his voice dry and formal, "I've been instructed to conduct an independent review of your findings on this case. There have been concerns raised regarding the unconventional nature of your preliminary reports." He emphasized unconventional with a slight, almost imperceptible curl of his lip. My jaw tightened. Concerns? From whom? I knew this wasn't a routine review. It felt too sudden, too pointed. "That's above my pay grade," he answered dismissively, already setting up his own portable microscope on a nearby bench. He pulled a small, sterile kit from his bag. "I'll need access to your collected samples, particularly those you've been examining for unconventional trace evidence." The detective shot me a glance, a silent question passing between us. This was the adversary's move, I realized, a chilling certainty settling over me. Not a direct attack, but an attempt to undermine my credibility, to discredit my findings before they could even be fully processed. Someone was trying to muddy the waters, to make my ghost look like a figment of my imagination. I handed over the slides, a prickle of unease tracing its way up my spine. As he began to meticulously re-examine my samples, his movements precise and deliberate, I watched him like a hawk. Every twitch of his hand, every adjustment of the focus knob was scrutinized by my hyper-aware brain. He was following protocol, yes, but there was an underlying tension, an almost performative scrutiny that felt off. He spent a good 20 minutes adjusting, peering, making notes. "I'm not seeing anything here, Cole," he announced finally, pulling away from the eyepiece. His voice held a note of smug finality. "No unique particulates, just standard environmental dust and textile fibers. Perhaps your initial observations were influenced by fatigue or an overactive imagination." He pushed the slide back towards me, a dismissive gesture. He had to be lying. I had triple-checked my findings. My ghost was real. I leaned back into the microscope, my gaze narrowing. I didn't look for my particulate this time. I looked for his. I rotated the slide, adjusting the light, searching the periphery, the slide itself, the edges of the cover slip. And then there it was. Not the iridescent particulate I'd found, but something else entirely. A single, almost invisible filament, a shade of synthetic blue I recognized. It was a common fiber, yes, but the context was wrong. It wasn't embedded in the victim's clothing, nor was it part of the ambient dust I'd meticulously cataloged. It was lying on the surface of the cover slip, almost like an afterthought, a delicate, almost transparent spiderweb strand. And it wasn't there when I'd last examined it, I was certain. My memory for microscopic details was absolute. I zoomed in, bringing the fiber into sharp focus. It was a polyester-nylon blend, commonly found in certain types of laboratory gloves, specifically the kind with anti-static properties. The kind my senior colleague was wearing, but it wasn't from his gloves, not directly. This fiber was old, slightly frayed, and held a faint, almost imperceptible sheen of a very specific volatile solvent. A solvent often used to subtly alter the refractive index of certain synthetic materials, making them harder to distinguish from background noise under a standard microscope. My gaze snapped to the senior pathologist. He was already packing his kit, a satisfied smirk playing on his lips. He hadn't just missed my evidence. He had tried to obscure it. "You're right," I responded, my voice dangerously calm, the words precise, each one a hammer blow. You're not seeing anything because someone tried to make sure you wouldn't. I gestured for the detective to look. Detective examined the surface of the cover slip. You'll find a single blue synthetic fiber, a polyester nylon blend, and if you run a mass spec on it, you'll find trace amounts of a proprietary solvent, a refractive index modifier. The detective leaned into the eyepiece, his brow furrowing again. He saw it. His eyes, when he pulled back, were flinty. This fiber, I continued, my voice rising slightly, was not present when I sealed this slide. It's an external contaminant, and the solvent residue suggests a deliberate attempt to make the original evidence I found less visible, to invalidate my findings, to discredit my work right here in the mobile forensic unit at remote crime scene. I turned directly to the senior pathologist, who had frozen, his face blanching. Someone knew I found something. Someone sent I to make it disappear, and in doing so they left their own calling card. The air in the unit crackled with tension. The senior pathologist stammered, his earlier confidence crumbling. That's preposterous, an accidental transfer perhaps. Accidental. I cut him off, my voice laced with steel. With a solvent designed to obscure specific optical properties. No, this wasn't an accident. This was a direct, calculated attempt to sabotage an ongoing investigation. And now, thanks to your unwitting assistance, we know the adversary isn't just invisible. They're watching, they're reacting, and they're getting desperate. The detective looked from me to the now pale senior pathologist, then back to the slide. The implications were stark. The game had just escalated. The ghost wasn't just leaving clues, it was playing defense. And it had just shown its hand, however subtly. The fluorescent lights of the mobile forensic unit at remote crime scene hummed, a low, constant drone that had become the soundtrack to my life for days. The air was thick with the scent of sterile wipes and something metallic, like a fresh wound. I was hunched over the microscope, my eye socket aching from the pressure, the world outside the eyepiece a blur. The senior pathologist had retreated to a corner, nursing a lukewarm coffee, while the detective leaned against a workbench, arms crossed, his gaze fixed on me, a silent, heavy question in his eyes. The slide under my lens was the one that had stopped us cold in the previous hour. A carefully placed trace, seemingly innocuous, yet its very presence screamed misdirection. The ghost wasn't just elusive, it was taunting us, leaving breadcrumbs that led straight into a trap. But something about this particular breadcrumb felt off. Too perfect, perhaps. I adjusted the fine focus, minutely shifting the stage. The trace material, a microscopic filament, glowed faintly under the polarized light. It was a synthetic polymer, common enough, but its composition and weave were unique, consistent with a very specific type of outdoor gear. The implication intended by our adversary was clear, an unknown hiker perhaps, but my gut churned. It was too easy. The meticulous cleaning, the utter absence of anything else, and then this solitary, distinct fiber. It felt like a stage prop. Coal. The detective's voice was a low rumble. Anything. I ignored him, my focus absolute. My mind was a kaleidoscope of every crime scene photo, every victimology report, every environmental sample we'd painstakingly collected and cataloged. Where did this fiber not fit? What was it trying to obscure? I zoomed in further, pushing the limits of the lens, chasing the absolute edge of visibility. Then I saw it, not the fiber itself, but something on it. A minuscule particle, barely a micron across, embedded in the synthetic weave. It wasn't dust, nor was it a natural spore. It had a crystalline structure reflecting the light in a specific, almost metallic way. My breath hitched. This wasn't just a contaminant, this was a signature. You see that, senior pathologist? I muttered, not looking up. The senior pathologist stirred, moving closer, his face etched with a mix of fatigue and renewed apprehension. He peered into the second eyepiece I'd attached. A long silence stretched, broken only by the hum of the unit. Impossible, he finally breathed, a tremor in his voice. That's an industrial abrasive, a specific type of garnet used in very high-end precision grinding. My mind raced. Precision grinding. Not something I'd find on a hiker's jacket. Not something I'd pick up casually. This wasn't about the fiber anymore. It was about the particle. The killer hadn't just planted a misleading clue. They'd inadvertently left their own microscopic fingerprint embedded within it. The fiber itself was a red herring, but the garnet particle was the anchor, a tiny, almost invisible hook. I pulled away from the microscope, my eyes gritty, but a surge of adrenaline coursing through me. It's not just any garnet, is it? That specific type used in. What was it? Dental labs, high-precision optics manufacturing. The senior pathologist nodded, his eyes wide. Both yes, but the specific grade and angularity. It's more common in bespoke optical lens grinding or certain specialized jewelers. Very fine work, not something you just stumble upon. The detective stepped forward, his expression hardening. So, our hiker works with high-precision optics or custom jewelry, or someone in their immediate vicinity does, I clarified, already moving. And they're good. They cleaned everything else, this particle. It was an oversight. A tiny, almost imperceptible mistake carried on the very thing they meant to distract us with. I pulled up the digital crime scene photos on a large monitor, zooming into every crack, every surface. Think about the meticulousness, the cleaning agents, the lack of anything. This isn't random. This is someone who understands forensic science, someone who plans, but they aren't perfect. Nobody is. My gaze fell on a detail I dismissed before, a faint, almost invisible scuff mark on the victim's belt buckle. We'd attributed it to the struggle. Now I saw it differently. It wasn't a scuff. It was a minute abrasion, a series of parallel lines so fine they were almost imperceptible, consistent with a very specific type of polishing. The victim's buckle, I added. Run a sweep for particulate matter on this specific area, and check the victim's hands again under the nails, the cuticle folds. Anything that points to fine dust, metal shavings, anything even remotely related to grinding or polishing. Minutes later, the junior technician who'd been silently observing let out a gasp from his station. "Cole, I've got something." On the victim's left index finger, a microscopic fleck. It matches the description of the garnet. And there's something else. A residue, organic but not human. A resin, I think, very specific. The pieces clicked into place with a sickening thud. The meticulous cleaning, the precise, almost surgical nature of the crime, the misdirection, and now the garnet and the resin. It wasn't just about optics or jewelry. It was about making something. Something precise, something valuable, something that required intense focus and a specific environment. The motive, I stated, my voice low, isn't passion. It's preservation. Protection of a secret, of a process, of something they were creating. I looked at the detective, then back at the senior pathologist. The resin, the garnet, the specific type of cleaning agents used, it all points to a controlled environment, a workshop, and the killer didn't want anyone to know what they were working on or where. My mind flashed back to the initial victim report. The victim had been a financial auditor, investigating discrepancies in a specialized small business. A business dealing in bespoke creations, high-end, custom-made items. There was only one suspect who had the means, the motive, and the access to this level of specialized equipment. I replied, the name forming on my lips, chilling me to the bone. The one we initially dismissed because of the perfect alibi. The ghost didn't just clean the scene. They cleaned their entire life meticulously, but they couldn't clean away the dust of their obsession. I looked directly at the detective, my voice firm, every doubt erased. It's the owner of the bespoke optics firm, isn't it? The one who made those incredibly intricate custom pieces. The one the victim was auditing. The one with the perfect, unimpeachable alibi, because they were working alone in their sealed workshop during the time of death. The detective's eyes narrowed, a grim understanding dawning. The senior pathologist let out a long, slow breath. The game wasn't just escalating, it was over. We had a name. And the ghost wasn't invisible anymore, just incredibly, terrifyingly precise. The hum of the generator powering the mobile forensic unit at remote crime scene was a low, insistent growl, a counterpoint to the thrumming in my own ears. Outside, the last vestiges of twilight bled into a deep, moonless night, the only light spilling from our unit's windows. I stood over the illuminated dissection table, not with a body but with a series of magnified slides. Each slide held a fragment, a whisper of a story that the killer had tried desperately to silence. The senior pathologist was perched on a stool, nursing a lukewarm coffee, his gaze fixed on the digital microscope screen, where a cluster of peculiar, iridescent mineral particles shimmered. The detective, ever the silent sentinel, stood by the unit's rear door, his arms crossed, his face a mask of grim anticipation. "It's all here, isn't it, Cole?" The senior pathologist finally broke the silence, his voice barely above a murmur. I nodded, my eyes still glued to the microscopic world. Every single particle, embedded so deeply in the synthetic fibers of the victim's coat and in the very epidermal ridges of their hands. It survived the wash, the scrub, the bleach. It's tenacious, just like our ghost. The detective pushed off the door frame. "He's here." The driver just radioed in. A knot tightened in my stomach. This was it. The moment I'd been working towards, the ghost finally given flesh and bone. Moments later, the unit's door hissed open, letting in a gust of cold air and the figure of the adversary. He was brought in by two officers, his face impassive, almost bored. He looked around the cramped space, his eyes briefly flicking to me, then to the microscope before settling on the senior pathologist. There was a faint, almost imperceptible smirk playing on his lips. He was confident. He still believed he was untouchable. "Have a seat," the detective said, gesturing to a metal folding chair bolted to the floor. The adversary complied, his movements fluid, unhurried. He was calm, too calm. I moved from the microscope to stand opposite him, placing my hands on the table, leaning slightly forward. The generator hummed louder now, or perhaps it was just the blood rushing in my ears. "We found something," I began, my voice steady, betraying none of the internal tremor. "Something I missed." His eyes, a startlingly pale blue, met mine. There was no flicker of surprise, no tell, just that infuriating faint smirk. I assure I missed nothing. I was nowhere near that property. "Oh, I know I weren't at the property, not in the conventional sense," I countered, picking up a small, sealed vial from the table. Inside, a minuscule pinch of shimmering dust was visible. "I were far too careful for that, but I was near enough, or rather, your environment was." I clicked a button and the digital microscope screen projected onto a larger monitor mounted on the wall. The iridescent particles, magnified thousands of times, filled the screen. They gleamed with an almost unnatural light. "These," I explained, pointing to the image with a stylus, "are unique. A very specific blend of silicate and an uncommon metallic oxide. They're not found naturally in this region. In fact, they are only found in one very particular, isolated quarry about 200 miles north of here. A quarry that specializes in a rare type of decorative stone. A quarry where I happen to own a substantial stake and visit regularly by my own admission to inspect shipments." The adversary's smirk faltered just for a fraction of a second. "These particles," I continued, my voice gaining momentum, "are incredibly fine, almost like a dust. They embed themselves in clothing fibers, in hair, even in skin pores. I transported them, from my quarry to my clothing to my hands. And then, when I handled the victim's coat, when I made contact with their skin, even through gloves, I transferred them. The only sound was the generator's thrum. I see the cleaning, the scrubbing, the bleach. It took care of the major forensic markers, but it couldn't remove something so deeply ingrained, so intrinsically linked to you. It's a signature, really. My unique signature, carried from my private domain to the crime scene, then back again, before I transferred it to the victim." The adversary's face finally cracked. The smirk vanished, replaced by a flicker of pure, unadulterated rage. His jaw tightened, a vein pulsing at his temple. "I were fabricating this," he snarled, his voice low, guttural. "A desperate attempt to pin something on me." The samples were taken from my personal vehicle, from the driver's seat upholstery, from my home office rug, and from the victim. I countered, my voice flat, professional. They are an exact match. Irrefutable. The senior pathologist here can corroborate the analysis. The senior pathologist nodded gravely, his eyes never leaving the adversary. Suddenly, the adversary lunged. It was swift, unexpected. He didn't go for me or the detective. His target was the microscope, specifically the small vial of dust I had just held. He wanted to destroy the evidence, to wipe away the last damning proof. My reflexes, honed by years of split-second decisions in the morgue, kicked in. I was already leaning forward, my hands on the table. As he surged, I slammed my forearm down, blocking his path to the vial, simultaneously twisting my body to use the table as a barrier. His shoulder connected with my chest, a jarring impact that knocked the wind out of me, but I held my ground. The detective, a blur of motion, was already there, his arm snaking around the adversary's neck, pulling his back from the table with surprising force. The adversary struggled, a desperate, animalistic grunt escaping him. He thrashed, trying to break free, but the detective's hold was like iron. The two officers rushed forward, quickly subduing him, pinning his arms behind his back. The struggle was brief, brutal, and utterly silent save for the grunts and the shuffling of feet. As they secured him with cuffs, I rubbed my chest, catching my breath. My heart hammered, a frantic drum against my ribs. He had been so close, so terrifyingly precise, even in his desperation. The adversary, now restrained, glared at me, his pale eyes burning with hatred. There was no smirk now, only a raw, exposed fury. "I won't get away with this," he spat, his voice hoarse. "I don't know who I read dealing with." I met his gaze, my own resolve hardening. "Oh, I think I do," I replied, my voice calm despite the lingering adrenaline. "I know exactly who I'm dealing with, a ghost." And now, IREF finally visible. The officers led him out, the unit's door hissing shut behind them, sealing us back into the generator's steady hum. I looked at the shimmering particles on the screen, then at the intact vial. The game wasn't over, not truly. But for the first time in a long while, I felt like I had finally, truly won a round. The officers led him out, the unit's door hissing shut behind them, sealing us back into the generator's steady hum. But for the first time in a long while, I felt like I had finally, truly grasped the edge of the truth. My breath hitched, a small, involuntary gasp that surprised me. The microscopic fragments, barely visible even under the high magnification, were more than just dust. They were a signature, unique and undeniable. I spent the next 4 hours hunched over the microscope, meticulously documenting every facet, every subtle variation. The patterns, once elusive, now screamed a story. It was a synthetic polymer, engineered with a specific blend of rare earth elements, a material so specialized it could only have come from one source, one particular laboratory. And that lab, I knew, belonged to a former colleague, a brilliant but volatile chemist who had vanished from the scientific community years ago after a scandal involving intellectual property theft. My stomach clenched. It couldn't be. Not him. I called the lead detective, my voice raspy from disuse and adrenaline. "I have him," I answered, the words feeling heavy on my tongue. "Or at least I have the evidence that points directly to him." The detective listened, his skepticism palpable even through the phone line. The weight in my voice must have convinced him. He dispatched a team. Within the hour, the mobile forensic unit at remote crime scene was abuzz again, not with the frantic energy of discovery, but with the quiet, methodical precision of confirmation. My findings were cross-referenced, verified by another expert I trusted implicitly, a quiet analyst who specialized in obscure materials. The confirmation came back, stark and definitive. The polymer matched samples from the chemist's abandoned lab, samples that had been flagged years ago but never fully understood. The apprehension was swift. My former colleague, the chemist, was found not far from the crime scene, living under an assumed identity, meticulously cleaning a small, rented cabin. They found more of the unique polymer there, embedded in his clothing, in the fibers of his worn rug. He hadn't anticipated that even the most advanced cleaning protocols couldn't erase a signature woven into the very fabric of his existence. He had been so careful, so arrogant in his precision, believing he understood every angle of forensic science, every limitation. He had, in his twisted genius, overlooked the one thing he couldn't control, the microscopic world and my obsession with it. The reveal hit me harder than any punch. His motive, when it finally emerged during the interrogation, was a bitter cocktail of professional jealousy and a perverse sense of justice. He blamed me, specifically, for the downfall of his career, for a minor oversight I'd pointed out in a published paper years ago that had, in his mind, triggered the subsequent investigation into his unethical practices. He saw himself as the victim, and this entire elaborate murder, this meticulous erasure of evidence, was his grand performance, a challenge to prove himself superior, to expose what he saw as my own professional blind spots. He wanted to watch me fail, to see me drown in the very details I prided myself on. The audacity of it, the sheer, cold calculation, made a tremor run through me. He hadn't just murdered a stranger. He had targeted me, using the victim as a pawn in his personal vendetta. The trial was a spectacle. Prosecutors presented my unconventional evidence with a mix of awe and trepidation. I spent days on the stand, explaining the intricate dance of light and matter, the unique spectral signature of the polymer, the almost imperceptible transfer patterns. The defense tried to discredit it, calling it speculative science, microscopic conjecture. But the evidence, once seen, once understood, was irrefutable. The chemist, a gaunt figure in the courtroom, watched me with a chilling intensity, a flicker of something akin to admiration in his eyes when the jury foreman finally read the verdict, guilty. The public reaction was a whirlwind. News channels dubbed the chemist the ghost cleaner and me the microscopic detective. There was a morbid fascination with the case, with the idea of a killer so precise and a pathologist so obsessive. For a while, my quiet life was anything but. The case had been solved, the killer imprisoned, but the echoes lingered. The personal cost was immense. The sleepless nights, the relentless grind, the gnawing anxiety that I might miss something, that his game might truly break me. Justice, I realized, wasn't a clean, clinical equation. It was messy, human, and often incomplete. The victim was gone, their life extinguished by a man's twisted ego. And while the chemist was behind bars, the scars he left on me, on the system, remained. But there was also a strange, hard-won piece. The case had forced me to confront the deepest corners of my own trauma, the fear of inadequacy that had plagued me since that other, older failure. This time, I hadn't failed. This time, my obsession had led to truth, not just a lingering question mark. The invisible adversary had been made visible, not through brute force or conventional means, but through the very details he thought he had erased. My scars were still there, etched into my professional soul, but they felt less raw now. They were a testament not to failure but to survival. I stood at the window, watching the city lights blur into the night, and I knew, would still be looking for them.